Give us a sense of what this problem is and how do we measure how big it is?
So, David, first of all, it's great to be here, and I don't have easy solutions out of this. But you're right. There's an alarming destruction of biodiversity, forests, wetlands, prairies around the world. And as you said, a staggering extinction episode, which I think has really grave, implications for humanity in terms of prosperity and the well-being of people on Earth. Now, we're just and to put some parameters around this extinction episode, that it's playing out at 1,000 times the normal level, which means that rather than losing 1 to 5 species a year, we're losing a lot. And, if this continues unabated, we'd lose, half of the animals and plants on Earth by mid-century. And, this would have an enormous economic impact. Now, we're just in the early stage, and scientists and economists are in the very early stage of being able to quantify and measure the magnitude of what this means economically. But one thing we know for sure, the best way to hedge against these risks is to invest in nature. And the problem we've had for some time is our economic systems don't really measure nature. They don't account for the value of the services provided by the natural world. And that's because we have market failures. These services and nature is treated as a free good. And so that means that those who invest in it to conserve it aren't appropriately rewarded. Those who destroy it aren't appropriately penalized. And so what we have done here with this study, and this study was done in support of an advance to a big UN convention on biodiversity, something that takes place every 10 years. This will be taking place in China. And what we did, which I really believe, breaks new ground, is we really drilled down on the capital flows into conservation globally, really focused on making the economic case for investing in nature.
Right.
And then we analyzed in great detail all of the different mechanisms and policies and tools that could be used to close this gap.
Right.
And to just lay it out very quickly, there's some good news and some bad news. The bad news is, as I said, we're losing biodiversity at an alarming rate, and the funds that need to be put into globally need to be invested in conserving nature are massive amounts. They're $600 to $800 billion annually. That's the bad news. The good news is there are a lot of tools and policies that can be used, and by far the least costly way is to not destroy our natural capital to begin with. Right. And so there are some things that governments can do that will require no money and will actually save money, which have to do with restructuring the flawed policies we have in terms of subsidies for agriculture, subsidies, forestry, and fisheries. So by restructuring those, that will close half the gap.
Yeah, and just to be clear for our audience, there's a report that's out from the Paulson Institute, your institute, along with the Nature Conservancy and the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. It's called Financing Nature, and this is all laid out very clearly in that report, which I commend to everybody. Comes up with that roughly $700 billion a year. You talk about a hedge as a practical matter. Can the markets take care of this on their own? We now have a lot of ESG funds. BlackRock's got a big one. Various people have big. Goldman Sachs, by the way, you may have heard of them. They have one as well. Could the private sector by itself take care of this?
No way. A matter of fact, one of the findings, which is very clearly, was that the private sector can do its part, but without a change in government policies, the private sector is not going to be able to take care of it. And, one of the things that's been clear to me over many years in terms of advocating for conservation, you need to get government to act, and government's not going to act without broad public support, broad business support. And to do that, you need to make the economic case. And the private sector has a lot of money that can flow into this area. What the government has to create the conditions for that capital to come in, has to create the proper incentives and financing mechanisms. So we lay out a number of those mechanisms, or change the subsidies. Or the other, I think one thing that the private sector could do that wouldn't cost a lot, it would make a big difference, and that we talk about in the report, is a different approach looking at the risks in the financial sector around investing and lending. And if banks throughout the world had screens, environmental protection screens, looking at the practices and principles and risks, and avoided funding harmful projects and infrastructure projects, and making sure there's planning done in advance, this would make a big difference. This would make a huge difference.
So, Mr. Secretary, it strikes me that this is not a very popular point of view with some of the populists we have. And let's talk very specifically even about the Trump administration. If anything, the Trump administration seems to be going a bit in the other direction, as the Department of Labor now is proposing rules that really curtail the ability of fiduciaries with ERISA pension funds to invest in ESG. Is this a time politically where there's the political will to move in the direction that you seek?
Well, this is a time where it's more important than ever to make the economic case. And I think we can make the economic case that is going to change politicians' views. And there's a number of positive things we see happening. So we see the investing community looking at these risks much more carefully. Take a look at the annual report that Larry Fink, the chairman of BlackRock, put out. Take a look at what the Business Roundtable has put out more recently relating to climate change and social responsibility. So I think what the question that you posed really raises the stakes for us to make the economic case. And there is a compelling economic case to be made. And that's what we try to do in our report.
Is it particularly difficult to make that economic case right now when we do have something of a global recession? We don't know, I think, where we are. Where do you think we are in terms of the strength of the economy, domestically as well as around the world? Can we sustain the sort of investment you're talking about?
Okay, so I'm going to make 2 points. In terms of where we are, this is a very serious challenge, much more significant than what we faced during the 2008 financial crisis, because we're dealing with a disease plus the economic impact. And a lot of your question is going to be determined by our ability to control the disease, no doubt about it. But I think the government came in very early, and I was very pleased with the leadership from Stephen Mnuchin working with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle to come up with a very expansive, fiscal program, a stimulus program. I was very pleased with what you saw out of the Federal Reserve. We staved off disaster. More needs to be done. But your question really gets to the recovery. And I look at where biodiversity is most threatened. It's not in the United States of America. It's threatened here, and I'm unhappy with what I see happening here and the decline in birds in North America and so on. But where it's hitting the hardest is in some of the developing countries that hold most of our biodiversity. So in Latin America and in Africa. And those nations are hit very, very hard by the pandemic. And there's a big economic collapse there. So it's going to take a lot of money to come in and to get those economies to come back. And my point here is that a green recovery can be a big part of what they do. And if you look at one of the things that I've done with my institute is work with the Inter-American Development Bank and worked with the president of Colombia, Iván Duque, who's assembled a group of the other 7 heads of state that own the Amazon. and advising them on programs and policies that would help stave off some of the very destructive deforestation of the Amazon. And a point that we can make over and over again is that there's a lot of money that will come into this region if there are good conservation programs, and that those can help drive an economic recovery. On the other hand, if they revert to destructive policies, that this will discourage investment from coming in. And as long as you brought up the pandemic, I would say some of the, as we've tried to put a value on natural capital, and we've tried very hard to do that, and it's not always feasible. It can be very difficult, and so often it's valued at zero. But as we strive to put a value on it, there's some things that we can't put a value on, but are very clear. For instance, that there's no doubt that the destruction of natural capital has brought wildlife closer to humanity. And this really increases the risk of zoonotic diseases. And given the probable cause of COVID-19, that is something that I think deserves a fair amount of focus today.
Really important point. Mr. Secretary, it does strike me, you talked about the global effects of this. This can't be dealt with by one country or another. It has to be dealt with internationally, as you point out in your report. Can this be addressed without the two largest economies coming together, that is U.S. and China? Because right now we seem to be at loggerheads with China. You know China terribly well. Is there any possibility of a rapprochement that could help us address issues like this together?
Well, as you well said, the environmental issues, whether we're talking about climate change or whether we're talking about biodiversity or migrating birds, they don't recognize national boundaries. These are global issues. And for that reason, most of the work that my institute is doing on environmental protection is focused in China, because they've got the biggest challenge and you can make the biggest difference there. And so there's a lot of good work right now being done in China around green finance, where it's a real testing ground for new financing tools and mechanisms. And we've been working on helping them develop principles and the right incentives to draw private capital into their green financing markets. And the reason we do that, it makes a difference there. But so much of the problem is going to be in developing nations, where the next 3 billion added to the population is going to occur between now and 2050. And many of these nations don't even have municipal finance systems. So if what works in China it can be replicated around the rest of the world, I think it can have a big impact. Now, in terms of your question about the U.S. and China, this is a very difficult relationship right now, and it's escalating downward at a dangerous rate. We're dealing with a very different China right now. The views toward China have really hardened among Republicans and Democrats, much tougher on China. And I think they need to be. But we need to be smart about what we do. And we need to make sure that while we identify the areas where we have differences with China, where there are conflicts, we figure out how to deal with those and how to manage those, while not precluding the opportunity and the need to work together to solve global problems. And I'd put climate change and the environment at the top of that. But you've got future pandemics, nuclear proliferation. There's a whole variety of major challenges, future economic growth, that aren't going to be solved satisfactorily unless we can figure out how to work, with China.
Yep.
I think that's very important, and that is something that I'm very focused on and very concerned about.